you as you start your missions week. Unless you live under a rock, I do not need to tell you that we live in one of those times when the news cycle feels somewhat apocalyptic. Wars that are declared to be over and then aren't over. Leaders that sometimes sound so irrational that you wonder if they're speaking the language that you speak. Institutions that 10, 20 years ago we trusted, we now go, what happened? And if you've never asked the question, is anyone actually in charge? You probably aren't thinking clearly enough. And Daniel asked that question long before there was CNN, long before Twitter, X, whichever social media platform you are unfortunate enough to visit. And Daniel wasn't writing as some detached observer. Daniel was in exile. Daniel lived in chaos. A believer, a follower of God in a system over which he had no control. Watching empires rise, harden, and often brutalize the people around him. And God didn't give him a strategy, God gave him a vision. Not a vision that denied the chaos, but a vision that reframed the chaos. And I want to go to Daniel 7 today. If you've got Bibles or you need to turn them on, I think we'll have the text up behind me. If not, find a friend. And I want to read the Daniel chapter 7. Just to put it into context, if you've read the book of Daniel, you probably got through the first 6 chapters relatively easily. It's kind of narrative, it's history, it's Sunday school stories that you knew, Daniel in the lion's den, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, handwriting on the wall, choosing what to eat, that sort of stuff, all those good Sunday school stories. And then you hit chapter 7, and the rest of it felt like you'd got stuck in the book of Revelation, and you really weren't sure what was happening. And Daniel 7 is the first of the visions that Daniel gets that are outlined in the remaining chapters of Daniel. So Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the other, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and had wings of an eagle. And I watched it until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear, was raised up on one of its sides, had 3 ribs in its mouth." I had ribs for supper last night, just saying. And it was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." After that I looked, and there before me was another beast. It looked like a leopard. On its back it had 4 wings like that of a bird. This beast had 4 heads and was given the authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims, trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts. It had 10 horns. And while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And the 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like eyes of a human being, and a mouth, and it spoke boastfully. As I looked, says Daniel, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. His hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire. Its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, the books were opened. Then I continued to watch. Where did I go now? Because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, its body destroyed, thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there, and I said, "What's the meaning of all this?" And he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive a kingdom and possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others and had eyes and mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He'll speak against the Most High and oppress his own holy people, and try to change the set time and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for time and times and a half. But the court will sit, his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty and power and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. All rulers will worship and obey. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts. My face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. Lord, won't you give us insight this morning? Help us to understand so that we might live according to truth. In Jesus' name. Now, some of you are sitting there going, I hope his flight is leaving soon. Now, I am not going to get into all of the possible interpretations of the beasts. You'll be glad to know. Because that would take a long time. And honestly, the answer to the question is what's going on is, thank you, Daniel, for asking for an explanation. You needed more. But a few things are true. What the beasts represent is the chaos of our world. They represent the human kingdoms of the world. And there are people who want to try and fit it into timelines and kind of this kingdom is Rome and this kingdom is Babylon and all of that stuff. The problem with all of those models is when a few decades go by, they no longer add up. And so I'm not going to try and get into them. Some of you might like that sort of thing, and then you want to tie it up to Revelation and get it all together. I'm too simple for that. I can't wrap my head around it. The beasts represent earthly kingdoms and the chaos that the world has lived in. They represent the fact that kingdoms come and go. Daniel's not just thinking theoretically, this is reality, and it may be that these beasts represented specific kingdoms, but for the purposes of what we're looking at this morning, that's not my goal. What is true is these kingdoms are anti-God, and they are ruled by people who are anti-God. And they often seem to be in charge. So the truth number one from this passage is we live in a beastly world. The kingdoms of this world are contrary to the kingdom and the values of God. They are evil. The outlook and future of the world has often looked bleak. If you read history and you read the commentators on their times when they lived, they often will go, Lord, where are you? What are you doing? Is there any hope? And Daniel understood this very, very well. As a young teenager, he is taken as a slave from his home in Israel, and he's yanked out and sent to Babylon, one of the most beastly kingdoms in human history, and is forced into slavery to serve the masters of those kingdoms. And our world today has many parallels. Again, if you've paid any attention to the news, political instability and abuse of power are everywhere. Ukraine, Venezuela, Iran, Taiwan. I have Taiwanese friends who live in constant fear at the moment that China is going to decide that no one will actually get in the way if they come and take Taiwan back. The Japanese are in a similar situation. What will China do, and who will stop them if they decide to do it? We're all very familiar with the situation in Israel and Palestine. 77,000 civilians on the Palestine side have died in the last year. That's now the official figure from the Israeli government. Children, women. Sudan has disappeared off the news cycle, but is in chaos. Thousands are dying monthly in Sudan. It's disappeared off the world news cycle. And then the so-called civilized nations can't agree. You know, we have people speculating as to whether or not we're going to end up in the Third World War over Greenland. And these countries are led by people who are dictatorial, seem to abuse power at will, enrich themselves, care little or nothing for the welfare of their people. The rich get richer, the more powerful get more powerful, and the downtrodden and the marginalized fight for survival, often trampled underfoot, enslaved to serve the purposes of those in power. It's estimated that 50 million or more people today live in slavery. At least 700 million people on our planet live in abject poverty. It's estimated that there are 1.3 billion disabled people on the planet, 80% of whom live in countries where there is little or no specialized care. Religious persecution is widespread. We've got some of the posters up on the wall. It's estimated that 400 million Christians face high, very high or extreme persecution on a daily basis. That's 1 in 7 of Christians in the world. 3,000 to 4,000 Christians die every year in Nigeria alone, the country that has the highest level of deaths for faith-related reasons on the planet. And lest we think it's just Christians, Muslims in over 110 different countries report regular harassment and discrimination because of their faith. It's a messy world. The beasts are alive and well. And then we narrow it down to the gospel needs. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4 says, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. There are 8.2 billion people on the planet. 3.1, 3.2 billion people of those have no access to the gospel, have never heard what Jesus did 2,000 years ago, and live in countries where that is actively prevented. Yes, we've made some progress. In 1970, there were about 170 million evangelical Pentecostal charismatics. 170 million in 1970. Today, 1.1 billion of those, of evangelical Pentecostal charismatics. People that we would largely feel comfortable fellowshipping with. But, as a percentage of the world's population, the number hasn't moved. So there are 17,000 nations, people groups. I would have said this to you 2 years ago. When the Bible says nations, it's not talking about the 200 or something countries that are registered with the United Nations. When the Bible talks about nations, it's talking about ethnic, linguistic people groups, about 17,000 on the planet. In 1970, 10,000 of those people groups had no access to the gospel. That number is down to around 7,000 now. We've made some progress. But there's still so much further to go. 1970, 1.6 billion people were estimated to have no access to the gospel. Now it's 3 billion. Largely due to, it's not that missions is failing, it's the population growth is outstripping what we can do. 80% of those 3 billion who have no access to the gospel have also never met someone who loves Jesus. 80%. How will they hear? How will they know? How will they see if they've never met us? Just to put it into perspective, because I'm guessing you're like me, 3 billion is just a really big number. If you put all of those 3 billion people shoulder to shoulder in a line, they would go backwards and forwards to the moon 4 times. Or if you line them up around the equator and you then started to go around and speak to each one of them, you'd have to go around the equator of the planet 85 times. That's what 3 billion people look like. Here's an interesting statistic that as I was going through the preparation. 2/3 of that 3 billion, so about 2 billion, can be reached with only 3 languages. Hindi, Arabic, and Mandarin. Anybody up for it? It's not quite as simple. Learning language is hard. Going to the places where they speak that language is hard. But we need people who are willing to do that. When you look at these numbers, look at the state of the world, it can be overwhelming. It can feel like the beasts are in control, winning and unstoppable. It can feel as if the gospel cause is hopeless. What can I do? But Daniel's vision is not primarily about the beasts. The beasts highlight God's enduring kingdom his judgment, his power, and the Son of Man who receives the eternal dominion. That's the theological center of gravity of Daniel chapter 7. The beasts are not in charge. God is. God is ruling, not reacting. Truth number 2. God was not caught by surprise by the beasts. God is not worried about the beasts. They serve his purposes. And this is not a new concept in the Old Testament. If you go to Psalm chapter 2, the psalmist describes this. Why do the nations, the beasts, conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven, the Ancient of Days, laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger. He terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king in Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of your earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, you beasts, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or you will be angry, and your way will lead to destruction, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The key contrast in Daniel is these beastly kingdoms and the Ancient of Days who appoints the Son of Man to rule. I am the true ruler over the beastly kingdoms, is the message of Daniel. And Jesus, calling himself the Son of Man, comes and in Mark chapter 14, verse 62, he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. We often hear it say that Jesus didn't claim to be God. We're just not reading it right. And in Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus very clearly identifies himself with the Son of Man who is appointed by the Ancient of Days to rule. What is obvious is not true. The obvious is the beasts seem to be in control. What is true is not always obvious. That is that God is in control. While the kingdom of the Ancient of Days may often feel defeated or under pressure, it is eternal and present. The Ancient of Days is firmly on the throne, and the Son of Man will accomplish his purposes. Do you believe that? The next time that commentator on the news goes, the world's coming to an end. Are you gripped by fear? Or do you go, I see beyond? Truth number 1, we live in a beastly world. Truth number 2, God rules, he does not react. And truth number 3 from Daniel chapter 7 is we are called to participate, not panic. We are called to participate, not panic. Daniel 7, verse 10. Thousands upon thousands attended him, the Ancient of Days. 10,000 times, 10,000 stood before him. And then further on, he, the Son of Man, was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. Jesus came proclaiming the real kingdom, died to seal its victory, and gave his followers instructions to see the kingdom come. And we are invited to participate and impact our world in two ways. Firstly, by living kingdom lives. As I said, by the time Daniel gets this vision in Daniel 7, he's been in exile nearly 50 years. He's served 4 kings. He's seen God work in power. He's seen these brutal beasts experience the power of his God despite Daniel's powerlessness. And there's these amazing passages in Daniel where these pagan kings declare the glory of God because of what God has done through Daniel and his friends. 450 years later, a man from Galilee came and started proclaiming the kingdom. The revelation of the kingdom ramps up as Jesus preaches, as he announces and describes this kingdom that is so different to the kingdoms we see. As an aside, I sometimes hear people talking about it as the upside down kingdom. I want to challenge that. The beastly kingdoms are the upside down kingdoms. The right side up kingdom is God's kingdom. And Jesus, you know this passage well, Matthew chapter 5. It's the manifesto of the kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit, says Jesus, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. It's my funeral bottle. Blessed are the meek, the powerless, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, because they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus goes on in Matthew chapter 5, and he talks about how we are salt and light. He sets a new standard for righteousness. It's not just the physical act of murder. Hatred needs to be rooted out. Relationships take priority. It's not just the act of adultery. Lust needs to be rooted out. Stop taking fancy oaths and promises and just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Move beyond an eye for an eye and equality justice and go the extra mile. Go beyond loving your neighbor for what benefit it is of you to love those who love you and love your enemy. And then one other kingdom value that Jesus introduces and promotes a little later on in Matthew chapter 20 that is particularly appropriate when we're thinking about beastly rulers, people who abuse power and authority. And in Matthew chapter 20, verse 25 and 26, disciples have just had this argument about who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus calls them together and he says, you know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. This is the kingdom of the Ancient of Days, the kingdom that makes no sense in the context of the beasts. Everything in us wants the King of Kings to come on the white horse with power. That was the disciples' mistake in Matthew chapter 28, just before Jesus ascends into heaven. When they go, Jesus, are you going to do it now? This picture of Jesus putting his head in his hands and going, okay, we're not done yet. Because for the disciples, the response to the Roman Empire had to be a display of power. But that's not the kingdom of the Ancient of Days. The kingdom of the Ancient of Days is the mustard seed that infuses itself into society. It's the kingdom that makes a difference through weakness, not through power. And we're called to live those lives as believers in the midst of the beastly mess. So the first participation is to become a king of citizens of this godly kingdom. And then the second part of the participation, for those of you who are wondering how this was going to tie into Missions Week, is by inviting the nations into God's kingdom. We're called to invite those captured and blinded by the beastly kingdoms to bow the knee to the Ancient of Days, because the Son of Man has paid the price for their rebellion, atoned for their sin, and made it possible to change sides as he has for us. Julian and I were having a discussion before the service about visas, which are all about citizenship. I have dual citizenship. I have a British passport and a South African passport through accident of birth. And it's convenient. But I married a wife who only has a South African passport, and for her to get a British passport would require us jumping through hoops and paying money that I am just simply don't have and would not be willing to pay anyway. And so, if at any point, if one of the countries, the UK or South Africa, decides that me having dual citizenship can't happen, I will put my British passport in the post and send it to King Charles and say to him, thank you. You can keep it. That's a choice I've made. Which kingdom are you a citizen of? And are you out there recruiting for the kingdom of God? Because that's what Jesus did. He made it possible for us to change passports from the beastly kingdoms to the Ancient of Day kingdom. And that's why we're here. In Matthew chapter 28, the passage you all know well, Jesus comes to his disciples and he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. That's the vision of Daniel in chapter 7, when the Son of Man comes before the Ancient of Days and he is given the keys to the kingdom. And he says, therefore, because I have all authority, I have an assignment. I want you to participate. I want you to be a part of it. Don't panic. Don't run around like headless chickens trying to make everything happen. Here's the instruction. Here's the invitation to participate. Go and make disciples of all nations. Go and find people in these people groups and invite them to join my kingdom. Baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. Pass on the values of the kingdom. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. God's reign is secure. We are not fighting a battle to see whether or not God's going to win. That's done. And the nations will worship him. But right now, many do not. You've probably heard John Piper's incredible quote about missions, and I'm going to read it again. Missions is not the ultimate goal of the church. Worship is. Now, too many people stop reading there and go, oh, well, we worship in church, we're done. No. Missions exists because worship does not. Worship is ultimate, not missions, because God is ultimate, not man. When this age is over and countless millions of the redeemed fall on their faces before the throne of God, missions will be no more. I'm called to a lifetime of missions, and I know I'm working myself out of a job. When I get to heaven, God's going to have to give me another job. But missions is a temporary necessity. Worship abides forever. Worship, therefore, is the fuel and the goal of missions, Piper says. It's the goal of missions because in missions we simply aim to bring the nations into, wait for it, the white-hot enjoyment of God's glory. That's missions. The goal of mission is the gladness of the peoples in the greatness of God. God reigns, let the earth rejoice, let the coastlands be glad. But worship is also the fuel of missions. Passion for God in worship precedes the offer of God in preaching. You cannot commend what you do not cherish. Missionaries will never call out, let the nations be glad, who cannot say from the heart, I rejoice in the Lord. Missions begins and ends in worship. We do mission because there are 3 billion people who have never had the opportunity to understand that the worship of God is what they were created for. That's why we do missions. And why is it urgent? Because people have a limited lifetime. And we need to get to them. Because right now, as I've been standing here, I have no idea how long it's been because you don't have a clock in the church, which is wonderful for me. Thousands have died who have never heard what you have heard, some of you, every week of your life, and read about it in between when you read your Bibles. They have never heard. And that's why mission is important. We will have the whole of eternity to enjoy one another, to enjoy Jesus, and to enjoy worship. But we only have this lifetime, our lifetime, to impact those who've never heard. The battle is not for the kingdom. The battle is already won. The battle is for the worship of our King, the Ancient of Days. Missions is not merely an activity of the church. It's the reason we exist. And why Jesus hasn't just taken us up into heaven already. Worship is our main goal. But we could do that in heaven. But while there are people who have not heard, Jesus is keeping us here. Matthew chapter 24 verse 14 says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Why has Jesus not come back yet? I don't know. Because ultimately it's in his hands. But one of the reasons, and in my mind the most significant reason, is there are still far too many people who've never heard the gospel. Missions is not primarily an action. It's an attitude. As you look around the world, are you tempted, as Peter was when he was walking on water, to see the wind and the waves and to take your eyes off Jesus, to look at the beastly kingdoms, the chaos of the world? Or do you see the kingdom of the Ancient of Days, firm and secure, led by the Son of Man, who is waiting for men and women from every nation, people, tribe, and language to worship him? That's what we're called to participate in. That's the mission we're commanded to be a part of. As individuals, As a congregation, what part are you playing in seeing the enslaved by the beastly kingdoms come to a knowledge and worship of the Ancient of Days? Daniel 7 doesn't end in panic, protest, policy. It ends with authority given and worshipping rising from every nation. Mission then is not God scrambling to fix a broken world. Mission is God inviting his people to participate in what is already decided. We're called to invite the nations to join us in our knowledge and our worship of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. The nations are not a problem to be solved. They are an inheritance already promised. And that changes everything. We don't engage with the world because we're scared it's spinning out of control. We engage because we know where it's headed. We don't go because we feel guilty. We go because the Son of Man is worthy of worship in every language. And notice in Daniel doesn't see the nations rushing to the throne in panic. He sees them drawn. Our role is not to be frantic saviors of the lost, but to be faithful witnesses of a better King. So when we speak about gaps, Connie, the peoples, the languages where Christ is not yet known, we're not talking about God's absence. We're talking about his invitation. Not in reaction to beastly chaos, but to participate in God's unstoppable purpose. Because while the beasts rage, and they do, the throne is ready, the Son of Man reigns, and the nations, every last one of those 17,000, are still his. Are you part of what God is doing? Are you playing your part? Because that's the question every follower of Jesus has to ask. What am I doing? What am I doing to make it possible for others to experience what God has already done? And it starts right outside. But I suspect that you would have to work quite hard to find someone in Richards Bay who's never heard about Jesus. I'm sure there are some, but I think you'd have to work pretty hard to find them. Most of the people who are your neighbors have heard the gospel multiple times. The 3 billion who have no access, that's the problem. There's no one who loves Jesus, who lives near them, who encounters them, who can share the reality. And that's why we cannot give up on the mandate of Matthew chapter 28. And it requires people to go.